G'day legends, I hope that you are having a fantastic day, and so far you are having a fantastic week. Now, I will quickly record this video and then I will go and see my oncologist to see if I am healthy enough to begin the chemotherapy following the last round, and of course a few weeks of travel. The longer and longer I do the chemo, the longer and longer it takes to me to recover from each round, so we have to be very careful on these checkups. Now, legends, of course, as always, we do have a lot to go over. So, of course, we're going to be looking at the maps. We're going to compare maps, but we're going to do a very deep dive into Pokrovsk. Not only what has occurred, what is occurring, but then we're going to look beyond, because Russia's ultimate goal is not Pokrovsk. It's the rest of Donetsk and the major settlements that remain. So we're going to look at where Russia is moving, why that makes sense, and the difficulties for both Russia and Ukraine and their goals around this area. So a very deep dive on that. Of course, what we can't ignore is Zelensky's decision to, of course, clamp down on these anti-corruption bureaus. And we're going to talk further about this because everyone loves to paint this, that this is a completely separate issue from what's occurring in international affairs and on the battlefield. And it's not. It's setting up for decisions being made in the future and being able to control the narrative, potentially control the collapse. So we're going to talk about that in the beginning. Then we're going to look over Syrsky, of course, Commander-in-Chief Syrsky, talking about the situation on the front line, as well as narratives being set, the future of the war, what he's requesting as well. And we do know that Syrsky is a real threat to Zelensky's power. So in this folder, I've got 1 and 2. So this is going to be talking about the protests that we're seeing, as well as a conclusion coming from that the battlefield and this decision are not separate things, although people will love to paint it that it is. But then we're going to go over this Washington Post article here about what Syrsky has said and see that this is all intertwined. And like we say, that war is like an organism. You push here and it pulls there. And when you are at an all-out war like this, every single thing done in Ukraine's politics to the front line is all about the war. These are not separate. So, of course, a lot to go over, and the video is probably going to be very long. So let's just quickly start with this. And this is being reported from Russian news TASS, but that Russia had a meeting in Istanbul. It went for about 40 minutes. Now, realistically, nothing really became of this. There's going to be more POW swaps of soldiers and civilians, but as far as negotiations on settling the war, there's nothing to speak of there. And we do know that opening the meeting, the Turkish foreign minister, he hoped that they would actually have progress based on then the meetings that came before this back in June. And he said to end the bloody war as soon as possible. The ultimate goal here is, of course, a ceasefire that will pave the way for peace. But what we're seeing is that Russia has not changed its position or its demands for years. And although they are still a long way off achieving this offensively on the battlefield, they are substantially closer day by day and substantially closer than weeks ago, months ago, years ago. And that is not getting closer at a constant or linear rate. It's getting closer more quickly. Now, why is there no change on demands here? Well, Ukraine, they are showing immense signs of strain, or as we put it, rot internally. And this is what attritional warfare does. And currently, with Russia seeing this, their command, their politicians, well, they're not willing to make a compromise. And what I would say is, if Ukraine was making around 30 kilometre squares a day, that Putin had protesters on the street for whatever reason, but if there's protesters on the street losing credibility, losing faith in the leader, there's mass AWOL on the front line and a manpower crisis, what would our advice to Ukraine be? Okay, so flip that the other way. Ukraine is losing that amount of ground. Russia's gaining that. There's protesters on the street. There's mass AWOL, manpower crises. Again, if it was in the reverse, what would our advice be? It would be to continue, and you'll achieve those goals politically through military means. And you win an attritional war as much as your enemy loses it. And the longer this continues, as far as the trajectory we're seeing, the worse Ukraine's position will become. And we may see either Putin keep these same maximalist demands, and they're not that maximalist in the grand scheme of things, or even could we see those demands increase over time? Trump's 50-day ultimatum, like the other ultimatums, I think we'll see that date in, 45 days, whatever it be from now. I think we'll see that come and go. So let's talk about these protests. And we see footage like this. Yesterday we spoke of that there were limited protests with a few hundred people, and the protests over Ukraine, of course, are significantly larger today. And something that people don't take into account is in Ukraine, Zelensky is nowhere near as popular as he is in the West. That many Westerners, and most NATO is Westerners, they believe in Ukraine, Zelensky is heralded as a saint, as a hero, whatever. There's far more criticism of Zelensky internally than there actually is online from either Western leaders or Western followers of this war. But those protesters are kicking off. Noah reports he puts up some images of these protests as well. Of course, this is against the citizens voicing strong opposition to legislation, which they see as a direct threat to the independence of the anti-corruption institutions, the NABU and SAPO. So basically, that Zelensky will have ultimate oversight of these agencies, these institutions that are meant to look for high-end corruption in Ukraine. So it's investigating yourself. You can see why this doesn't work. Now, not Noel reports, but they're trying to declare that Zelensky's decision and the war are completely separate, and they are not. In wartime, everything is interconnected. And what is this setting up? Now, this is actually in my conclusion for the part about Syrsky. So you'll see this again later in the video, but I think Leonid Rogozin is correct here. He says there can be all sorts of random tactical reasons for what Zelensky is doing to Western-backed anti-corruption bodies. But he must be fully aware that he is attacking crucial Western influence infrastructure in Ukraine. Remember that the campaign targets both anti-corruption law enforcement bodies and a crucial Western-funded NGO. These actions don't make much sense unless the plan is to end the war soon on whatever conditions and then brace for backlash for what effectively is going to be Ukraine's defeat. Narrative control. The answer is a Georgian-styled grey zone governance. Careful balancing between the West and Russia, democracy and autocracy that hinges on the complete control of law enforcement bodies. If this hypothesis is true, we might be having a substantial peace talks under the smokescreen of defiant bellicose rhetorics. Also, some kind of foreign agents law waiting for its moment. So let's break down this bellicose rhetoric and what is actually happening here. And the TLDR of this is, once you accept that a war can't be won conventionally, the next step is managing how defeat is perceived. Narrative control, and of course, then making your backlash significantly, or controlling that backlash as well. And we see this being set up through many comments from Zelensky, through to Syrsky, through to the media, from Washington, etc. And the rhetoric around the war remains loud, it's heroic, it's victorious. But the institutions are quietly being reshaped for a different kind of endgame. They're managing defeat or controlled collapse under the guise of inevitable compromise. So once you know it can't be won conventionally, you then manage how the defeat is perceived. You move the goalposts and you set people up slowly. So when it goes all in, it's not as much of a cold shock. And Zelensky knows exactly what these bodies represent. He hasn't done this off a whim. They represent Western oversight, Western pressure, and leverage over Ukraine's internal affairs. And he's gutting them now. And if he guts them now, I believe that he's preparing to consolidate internal power, possibly ahead of some uncomfortable concessions. What it does is it silences critics, it weakens oversight, and makes sure no foreign-funded institutions can weaponize accountability against those who have been making such decisions. We're going to go over that and more of this these managed defeat controlled collapse when we go through what Syrsky has said. But I know many people are here for the map, so let's get into the maps early on. Of course, here is Ukraine in the centre of your screen, the capital of Kyiv. Red areas occupied since 22, purple since 2014. Of course, the red check on this map, ground that Russia has made over the past 24 hours. The blue check, there's no blue check on the map today, but if you do see blue check, it's Ukrainian advancement in the past 24 hours. Green check is Ukrainian advancement over 2 weeks. So when you see the green check on the map today, I believe from the map's own key that that is a correction on the battlefield. Okay, so let's have a look. Let's start actually up in the north. And of course, we'll start in Sumy, of course, where Ukraine crossed into Kursk, Russia has crossed back into Sumy. We're going to talk a little bit more about Kursk in a bit because Syrsky has thrown some figures out there and I want to actually present some data that doesn't really represent how these figures are meant to be shown. So let's have a look at this. This is then Syriac's map in Sumy. Then in Sumy front, Russian army continue to regain the initiative in Kindrashivka, making small advances in the northern part of the locality. So down in here, making some ground. We have seen this area, both for Russia and Ukraine, be fairly liquid recently. Then we'll move across to the east and we'll come to the island boys of Kupiansk in Kindrashivka, of course, where they've been hanging out now for a couple of months. What we see is realistically the front line will be looking more like this. So between Radkivka, Kindrashivka, that Russia is continuing to exploit and make ground on the northern flank of Kupiansk. And this is becoming not becoming, it has been for some time, but it's further expanding the envelopment of Kupiansk. Now, all envelopments are very difficult because, of course, you're surrounded on 3 sides and that your logistics into here, you only have 1 or 2 routes, where if you are the enveloper, you have much more area to bring stuff in. The difficulty with Kupiansk is, of course, the Oskil River that splits it in 2, and if and when this collapses or gets squeezed, it's going to be vastly more costly, and a lot of equipment, like we saw happen in Kursk, may be left behind. So let's move our way down and then we'll come into the Terny front. So this whole area in here between Pishani and then Toretsk, we refer to as the Terny front. Now, what Russia has done is they've successfully created a kill zone in here. They have surrounded Ukraine effectively on 3 sides, although it's only from Pishani to Terny, but using the Oskil River, the only way in and out is through this small gap in here. And again, attritional war, the goal is not territory. The goal is to reduce your then opponent's ability to fight, and that is through attriting personnel or resource and pressure on government institutions as well. So let's have a look here. Now, we see a lot of green check in here. So let's look back at yesterday and then we come to today. Now, what we see is red check in here. So there is just a movement on the front line. So the green and the red in here tells me Russia did make an advance, but the map in itself, there's map corrections in here. So let's have a look on this Syriac map. We have multiple updates in here. So firstly, let's look at Syriac. Now I had to, because there was 2 map updates in one, I've had to crop out the writing, but we can get an idea of this. Now he shows there was a Ukrainian advancement around Karpivka. This is exactly what I've said needs to occur, because if this remains that 12-kilometre gap, your attrition rate is going to be very, very critical quickly. And then we see just to the north of Rydkadab, some ground being made by the Russians by Syriac map. So these maps looking a little bit more similar at this point in time. Then we'll come to the north of here and we see on the Borova front line around Zeleny Hay, Russia making some ground. This is then confirmed through this map here, Syriac maps, we can confirm that. And then we did see, as I showed you yesterday, down towards Tursky, a lot of grey zone opened up. So let's have a look at this. And Syriac map is saying this grey zone is red. There's ground being made down to then Torsky that sits down in here, although it's not popping up for me. There you go. As well as some ground being made in the direction of then Yampil in the Kremenar forest. Again, keep an eye on this front, because this front is going to become relevant for us when we talk about Pokrovsk in depth. Let's continue moving our way down. We'll come to Toretsk. No changes shown on this map today, although we do believe there is a lot of movement in here. And again, that Toretsk is becoming the eastern flank of Pokrovsk and a lot larger battle for Konstantinivka and then ultimately Kramatorsk as well. So let's have a look in here. He's saying that this area in here, this Sherbenivka, is all coming under control and filling in these last remaining areas before we reach these larger reservoirs as well, and hinging from Chasiv Yar all the way down into this area. Now, let's move into Pokrovsk, but of course, we're going to a much larger deep dive, but this is just the map update. So, of course, we have this spire coming out all the way to Novoshakhovye. We see more ground being made today around Mykolaiv as well. So we can confirm on the eastern side, Suryak had already showed that this is under control, but he's showing around then Popov Yar, Poltavka, that Russia is making more ground in this sector. Of course, we had a lot of talk yesterday of a major breakthrough in this area. There are multiple maps today showing that. Now, let's move our way into Pokrovsk actual. Then we have Udashny as well. Let's have a look on this. And Russian army continued encirclement of Udashny, so pushing on the western side and capturing new positions in Shevchenko. So Russia has really reignited the western flank. Of course, the eastern flank is where most of the success is, but as you flank around, the weakest points actually become the bottom of the flank. It's the hardest area. So we are seeing Russia make ground in and around Shevchenko, and we will start seeing around Promin, Horovka as well. And will we see Ukraine choose to pull out of here? Because, of course, that we talk about attritional war is to reduce your enemy's potential, and this could become just a huge killing field where what we have seen is Ukraine pull out way too late of every single area like this, whether it be Bakhmut or Avdiivka, or you could reel off 10, is pulling out way too late and suffering large losses on withdrawal. So let's move our way down, and of course we'll come into the south around Orokhiv. I think my map has somewhat frozen. It won't matter. We have Kamyanske, Plavne in here. Let's have a quick look. There we go. Loaded back up for me. And then we'll have Suryak map. He's showing more advancements being made. There are geolocations confirming some of these as well. So really out to about this tree line here as well as in Plavne, that Russia is continuing to make ground. I'll get more of those geolocations for you tomorrow. So I said we're going to talk about Syrsky, the situation, and then relate that to what Zelensky is doing. So we have a little bit of reading, and then we'll go over the conclusions in this. So Washington Post, Ukraine's top commander asks Trump to help take the war to Russia. Ukraine urgently needs US and Europe to transfer more air defense systems and missiles to Kyiv. And they want to take away any of the restrictions on deep strikes into Russia. Ukraine is facing challenges on the battlefield as it struggles to mobilise the troops needed to stem the grinding advance of a numerically superior foe. And I was thinking about this just before, and this is going to upset a lot of people. At this point in time at the war, as far as offensive operations, I will say I think Russia is not only numerically superior, I think tactically superior on the front line as well. And a good way to measure this is we see far more Russian tactics getting adopted by Ukraine than the other way. And of course, then advances on the battlefield as well. So numerical, but also wanting more air defense and of course the missiles that go with them. A fresh supply of air defense weapons, including US-made Patriots and drone interceptors, light aviation, could help thwart Russian attacks. And it could allow Kyiv to strike Russian production, targeting infrastructure, making then the drones and missiles. Syrsky say they're targeting virtually everywhere, that Russia's targeting everything. Our airfields, populated areas, infrastructure. We need a supply of ballistic missiles in order to be able to give the enemy a fitting rebuff. So air defense and strike the other way. But again, this won't have direct influence on the front line. It increases costs of the war, but it's just another cog in the machine, and the war is a very large, complex machine. The availability of any missile weapons in itself is a deterrent. So wanting to increase the cost, and if Russia you continue, then there will be this deterrent. Syrsky declined to comment on whether Ukraine has any of the powerful ATACMS, but it's widely understood that supplies have run out, and it's widely understood that America has like a dozen or maybe a dozen and a half left, which is actually very concerning. In July 4th phone call, Trump asked Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky if Ukraine was able to strike Moscow or St. Petersburg. He has since said Ukraine should not do so. We're going to break this down in a sec. We're just laying the foundations, guys. Trump also threatened to intensely sanction Moscow if no deal to end the fighting is reached in 50 days. But not only sanction Moscow, how much more sanction really can there be? But also the biggest part of this is secondary tariffs or sanctions on India and China. And that's where there's some doubt creeps into my brain, because I just don't know if the US is ready to hit the fucking NOS buttons, the Dominic Toretto NOS buttons on BRICS de-dollarizing, if then you have a huge interruption on India and China's sovereignty independence financially, and go, yeah, actually, maybe it is time to move away from the USD. It's not America's aircraft carriers that makes America a superpower. It's the USD. In addition to the air defence and missile insufficiencies, Ukrainian ground troops, who remain vastly outnumbered on the front line, are also running low on 155 RD shells. Syrsky said, we need an additional supply of armoured vehicles. We have highly motivated and courageous soldiers who can advance, but they need modern, reliable means of protection. But at the end of the day, you still need men to sit in machines. You can deliver what you'd want, but you still need someone to put the shell up the spout or sit in the driver's seat of a vehicle, and you need them to be motivated and have high morale. And I am just not seeing that, and I'm not seeing that there are enough to make any more than localized advancements. And anytime you push on advancement, you may wear larger cost as well, rather than a controlled withdrawal and trying to inflict larger losses. We were heavily criticised because we were defending and retreating. I had to do something, let's say, extraordinary. So that Ukraine was being criticised because we were just defending and retreating. So I had to go on offensive, an optical operation to show that we were doing something extraordinary. And this is a problem. This is a problem when you have propaganda optics driving military decisions, not military decisions backed by your propaganda. What you do, what you're meant to be doing, is you have a military decision, you make the correct strategic or tactical decision, and then your propaganda then fuels that to be the right, not feel the pressure that, yeah, we need to show an advancement, let's throw men into the fire. And what we're talking about is Kursk. With a small group of commanders, he concerted a plan to divert Russian troops by invading Russia's western Kursk region. Fuck all, Russian troops actually got diverted. Who got diverted? Ukraine. The operation set morale skyrocketing among Ukrainian troops, civilians desperate for news of advances along the front. And then what did it do after that skyrocket? It actually plummeted further than the beginning point. But critics claim the plan also left parts of the front line vulnerable to Russian attacks and ultimately contributed to more territorial loss. Critics at the time skeptical. The data now presents this. Nearly a year later, an intense Russian counteroffensive has pushed Ukraine out of almost all parts of Kursk that it once controlled. And of course, that roller coaster back down of morale after a failed, costly offensive. The Kursk operation will surely remain a defining turning point in Syrsky's legacy, not a positive one. The commander said that he stands firmly by it and that it was an essential plan that thwarted Russia's aims to seize more territory and relieve pressure on some parts of the beleaguered Eastern Front. No, look at the kilometre squares data. It sped up as Kursk went in. Ukraine sent its best forces and best vehicles into here and had very large losses. Kursk was not a net positive. It may have been a net positive optically, propagandally, but at the end of the day, when you're dealing with basic numbers of attrition on the front line, no. It did not relieve pressure. It relieved pressure for the Russians. More Ukrainian troops got diverted than Russians up there. Look at the data of the frontline squares. We see it move. Kursk got moved, and what did we say day one? Go back and watch my video. So the best way for Russia to counter this is continue pushing in the east and just try and stabilize that up there, because as soon as you push in somewhere, you're automatically surrounded on three sides and you don't have the advantage. And I'm not just, I talk a lot of shit, but I'm not just talking shit in this. Syrsky went on in this article to say that Moscow suffered 80,000 soldiers killed and injured in Ukraine's cross-border incursion into Kursk. That's how many Moscow suffered. There's no mention of Ukrainian losses in this. But how sure are we of that, Mr. Syrsky? Because this is actually the then confirmed losses of equipment here. So what we have is these are the Ukrainian losses. And as far as the vehicles and the artillery and everything in there here, we see 1,061, okay? And this is by this gentleman here, this NALCO. We've shared this before, but he actually continues to update this month to month as new vehicle losses or confirmed losses come in. And we see that the Russian losses are actually below that. But what we can say too is the Russian losses are not only lower in Kursk as far as vehicles and artillery total, but Russia has a lot more of it to lose. And we see losing things like infantry mobility vehicles, armoured vehicles. We can see we have 450 and around 85. And we see Ukraine losing way more infantry mobility vehicles, which would make sense being on the offensive. A similar number of fighting vehicles. We see Russia losing less tanks than Ukraine, but of course they've got significantly more tanks and a significantly larger industry to build tanks as well. We also see that Russia lost, I believe, less artillery too. So towed artillery, so SPG, so self-propelled guns. Ukraine's at 47, towed is 8. Let's look at Russia. SPG is 20 and towed is 5. And then we'll go over this. We see that this makes sense. This makes complete sense. But Ukraine was on the offensive. Okay, so automatically you're putting more soldiers at risk because you're not in dug-in positions. That 3-to-1 rule, that is a rule for what you want to fight. That doesn't essentially mean you're going to take 3-to-1 losses. But they were on the offensive. You're exposed. There was immediate ISR on Ukraine crossing. By pushing in like that, you are automatically surrounded on 3 sides. You're crossing a border that's not maintained. So, of course, you're going to have poor logistics moving across just the roads in there under ISR and drone. We saw in the FPVs, we see the FABs, all of that. And what these numbers don't take into account, I'm just purely showing you data on lost vehicles, but they don't take into account a bigger issue here, which is soldier quality. Ukraine's best crossed with the best vehicles crossed in here. Russia didn't have, they had some elite units in here to stabilise, but overall was nowhere near their best or their best equipment. These figures make complete sense. This is actually based on data and photographs, and it makes sense. This is what we would presume that we would see in an operation like this, but it does reflect when you go, well, what were the real losses of Kursk, and was it a net positive strategically or just for the ones that eat up the propaganda, which can be important when you're completely funded from externally, and your EU partners will completely eat up any narrative that you want to set, and they're the ones sending weapons. I guess there's a positive in that, but frontline, we saw it speed up, and we've seen, not only did we see the East speed up, but we've seen Ukraine not be able to switch off the Kursk operation because of what is now happening in Sumy. And the losses and the amount left behind here was huge, and the morale plummet even further following this. But we're getting off into the weeds. Let's continue on Syrsky. Getting more troops into the field remains a major challenge. He acknowledged that everything related to mobilization is very sensitive information. He says Russia is intensely targeting mobilization efforts both through propaganda and bombing recruitment centers. Funnily enough, there's many people celebrating the bombing of recruitment centers in Ukraine, but also, the propaganda, it may have an effect. It might have a 1% effect. Why is no one wanting to recruit? Because they can see that the war is not on a great trajectory. We see, if you think that Russian propaganda has more of an effect than the way that these recruiters are operating, that's bullshit. And there's no demobilization, there's no rotation. So you can't just say, and this is like Zelensky 101, is everything is Russian influence. You're like, well, maybe not. They may have an effect, probably much less than your own doings in this. While mandatory draft is only for men 25 to 60, Ukraine has begun experimenting with a program to mobilise 18 to 24-year-olds for 1-year contracts in exchange for large bonuses and travel missions. It has hardly gathered speed. No one's doing it. Again, if you didn't recruit for 3.5 years of war and you weren't willing to sign up when Ukraine was winning the war, why would you when they are losing? Syrsky said in a recent survey assessing the initiative found that more than half of the respondents that the motivation is more money. Maybe so, but also wanting to be rotated and not killed or injured on the front line. If it is increased, there will be more applicants, so wanting more money to go in here. But let's talk about our conclusion to all of this. So, Syrsky he poses a serious threat to Zelensky, especially now after Zelensky's credibility has been shattered. It doesn't matter what NAFO is saying online. They're not the ones who are going to be voting in elections, nor are they going to be fighting on the front line. NAFO's morale means nothing. The morale matters at the front line, those recruiting, those being conscripted, and those who are actually going to put their name on a ballot and vote at some point. Syrsky, he could get the Zaluzny treatment and be outed when there is real threat. Now, is this interview a political move? I believe that it is. I think he's positioning himself as the sober realist, while Zelensky, he clings onto PR narratives. Now, the focus that we see from this article is that the focus is now purely on strategic targeting and to achieve optical victories. But this remains a ground war and will be decided on the ground. And regardless of how much Ukrainian command tries to publicly ignore the deteriorating situation at the front line, eventually you'll pay the piper and it won't be ignored anymore. Deploying Patriot air defense systems, it will reduce the number of successful Russian missile strikes, but they will have zero effect on the ground drone swarms. So what we'll see is that Russia just lean more heavily into that, and they'll pivot their industrial manufacturing output more into the mass producing of the Quran, and that's the way it will go. Offensive and defensive weapons is always a cat and mouse game. And what we see is there's no operational plan to actually regain territory en masse. The real strategy here is relying on a Russian loss. And this is what we've said from the very beginning, that there was never a plan for Ukraine to have a victory. There was a reliance on Russian failure. So it was promised through the sanctions, then it was promised through time, then it was promised through manpower, now it's promised through air defense. And the strategy is to hold on long enough that Putin's cost becomes too high and that he voluntarily chooses to stop. But from the front line to street protests, it does not look like it will be Russia that will be the one that cracks first. And there's this illusion that from ATACMS to Taurus, and we know no more ATACMS are coming, no more Taurus is coming, that the missiles will change a war's trajectory. And if strategic strikes won and lost wars, Russia would have won very quickly, or we would never have had to deploy troops into Iraq. It simply is just another cog in the machine. I think it's greatly overestimated the effect as well. And that they won't change the war's trajectory. Ukraine, they may hit and take out a few Russian factories, but it won't shift the manpower or firepower imbalance. And what all of this is doing is this is not just doing an interview to do an interview. Same with Zelensky, with then the shutting down of these anti-corruptions. This is controlling narrative, controlling collapse. And what we're seeing from Kyiv to Washington, from media outlets to the usual war bloggers, is a gradual dose of reality being administered little by little. And they're easing the public into the idea of concessions and negotiations. They're doing this very slowly and carefully so you don't get a cold shock of what has occurred. Imagine if Zelensky or Syrsky or any of these media or whatever had made these comments a year or two before. It would have been cold shock and, oh my God, everything. It would have done that pendulum from extreme optimism to extreme pessimism. So now everyone brushes over these comments. Imagine if these comments were made 6 months, 12 months, 2 years ago. See, it's gradually bringing it forward, setting up that pseudo environment that we speak of. And they would have been slammed if they did this as defeatist or making concessions. But today it's very normalised. And that this isn't random. This is conditioning. And it's preparation for a reality that's been obvious to many of us for some time. And I had a friend look over this and he said to me, the same voices who mocked talk of negotiation or retreat are now laying the groundwork for it. Quietly, strategically, because they know it's coming and they are preparing the public to accept it without backlash. We know there is massive Ukraine fatigue in Europe and America. Zelensky's betrayal over the past days has not helped that. If you are on the fence in Europe or America or on the front line, it has not helped that. Something we don't speak about is if you're a soldier on the front line yesterday thinking about deserting, oh, yeah. But it's little by little. What do they say on Archer? I won't say the term. And we go back to this, that the rhetoric remains loud, heroic, and victorious, but the institutions are quietly reshaping for a different kind of endgame that managed to feed narrative, managing the narrative, which Zelensky can now do over these corruption agencies, and controlling the collapse. And therefore, that accountability cannot be weaponized from foreign-funded institutions. And as he says in this, we may see a foreign agent law come into play, so to further reduce that as well. That's how I am reading in all of that. I know there's a lot in that. Pause now and go crack yourself a beer, because we do have more to get into. We're going to talk about Pokrovsk, the situation in depth and beyond. What is the next steps? And basically a hole in the defensive line as well. We are working off a few different sources of data, but let's move our way down into Pokrovsk, and we see Pokrovsk, Dobropilia, and then of course we see where the main areas are in Donbas of Sloviansk, Kramatorsk, the ultimate goal in here. So we thought we'd just point out a couple of those areas before we belt feed through some of this. Now, Playfra on X has had this. Please go and follow. I try and include as much as I can any of the sources that I use, so you guys can go and do the same. And if you guys come to a separate conclusion than I, that's fantastic. And go and follow and support these people. Currently, the situation is the following. In the northern flank of the breakthrough, Russian reconnaissance sabotage groups constantly seep into Mayak and Pankivkia. So we have a couple of maps. We'll bring this up as we go, but are reportedly often destroyed. Some of them, though, were able to infiltrate much deeper towards Novo-Shakhove and cross what I call line 0.5, which is a smaller obstacle line before the main one. This breakthrough in particular is still very controversial, and no further information was published. So this is the northern flank. We have Novo-Shakhove. We see, if we go back on the deep state, that this is Novo-Shakhove, where this has broken through. This grey zone of these DRGs have moved around here, and moving that sort of finger around and further then enveloping. And this movement into Mayak and Pankivkia and moving through the lines that sit in here. So let's bring up then the next map of Pokrovsk East. And let's to give you an idea of where we are, is just on the actual eastern side of here. We have these reservoirs and terracons that sit in here of Rodiansky, Krasny Liman, and the movement between these as well, as we can see by the maps today. So in the center, the Russians are attacking a bit everywhere, especially between terracons and the ponds, as we showed you. They continue sending reconnaissance groups into this mine where fighting is ongoing, but the Ukrainians still hold positions. They're attacking in these areas now without noticeable success, although we are seeing this move further and further. So around just to the north in Zatishok as well. The Ukrainians were able to counterattack and reach Razene itself with a group of infantry. But it was then hit by the Russians, and the fate is unknown. But it is new footage. So let's have a look in here. That we see that Mykolaievka and this movement down into Razene as well, that we think the fate wouldn't be positive given this map has not showed it. If anything, it showed continual movement. So we're just building a foundation of what we're speaking about in here. In the south, so down around this area still, so still the southeastern then flank, the Russians are putting enormous pressure on this area from three sides. Let's have a look here. So we have Minograd and this area where we see today, we see this red zone in here moving. So this area in here, Minograd, and this Novo Konamichny is right in here as we've shown you. So his map is out of date to then the deep state, but it gives us an idea, which the Ukrainians are trying to contain. Fighting is ongoing, even in the centre, together with the northern part, while the southern part is under Russian control. Here, the Russians want to use the settlement as a base after Toretsk to launch further offensive operations with the aim of entering Minograd. So the Russians, what they're trying to do is enter these areas and then to get into then Minograd. And of course, Minograd begins the fight, the urban fight for Pokrovsk. So it closes up as we're seeing on this map and as we have seen on the Syriac maps as well. So let's close up some of these. But you get an idea, especially on the eastern side and the northern side, of where these movements are getting through major defensive positions and where these DRGs, reconnaissance sabotage, are able to move through. And that tells us a lot about how thin some of these lines must be. As I predicted, in early June, after seeing success on one flank, the Russians logically activated the other pincer, what we call Pokrovsk Actual or Pokrovsk West. That has the name of Udashny Kotliny direction, as we see by Syriac maps showing more movement in and around Udashny just down here. Here the Russians have been stuck for 7 months and have been only lately able to achieve some level of success in the form of threatening Udashny, but very capable Ukrainian units are present there, giving the Russians a very hard time advancing and exploiting any breakthroughs. Although we have seen then more resource allocated here as this has been increasing over the past days, and you activate the other pincer. But this is what you do, is you activate and then deactivate, activate, deactivate as there's resistance felt. Now, but we have to remember one more thing here. Ukraine's manpower shortage and the new front on the Pokrovsk-Minograd agglomeration eastern flank, which has multiplied its length. So as things lengthen, if you have a manpower shortage, that gets worse. Again, Mr. Syrsky, if you have a manpower shortage and a recruitment shortage and a skill shortage, maybe don't open up another 1,000 square kilometres in Kursk. But we see this as the flank grows, it lengthens the front line. The Ukrainians were forced to redeploy units from elsewhere, and this led to the weakening of Pokrovsk's frontal defence, which also held for about 7 months. And what we are seeing is, we saw down in these areas, Shevchenko, Zhirove, Pershi, Travnivia, in these areas, we saw this not move for some time. But as units have had to move to other areas due to shortages, we've started to see, like this grey zone shows in here, like the DRGs working in Pokrovsk itself, then we see it weakening. The brigade responsible for the defence of the settlement of Zhirove, right in here, right in front of Pokrovsk, and basically merging with its urban area, reportedly straight up ran out of infantry and was forced to retreat. Deep State said very similar, which the Russians immediately exploited with a specialised unit trained in urban combat and DRG attacks. It was that way the Russian DRGs infiltrated very deep into Pokrovsk by passing near the Telecons, starting to fight in the city's Donetsk district, but most importantly, basically reaching the city centre. Even the Ukrainians responded quickly with counter-sabotage operations. The Russians were able to reach the results they aimed for and ambush multiple vehicles, rendering part of the city unsafe. And what we heard, so the Russian then sabotage operation ambush happened right about here, so right in the centre realistically. But what we know is then there was a shitload apparently of blue on blue because, oh my God, the Russians are in the city, and there was other ambush and blue on blue attacks in here too, that now you don't know who's who in the zoo of Pokrovsk. And he shows this movement through then Zhirove, Torja as well area in here. The labelling isn't as great on some of these maps, but it's in this sector, this triunda as well. So next one, here we go. Now the Ukrainian command is forced to take a decision. Either stabilise the situation completely, which will inevitably end up weakening other directions, or start the withdrawal. So if you stabilise this, the resource you need into here, what's Russia going to do? Push somewhere else. Or you start a withdrawal. Sooner or later, the situation will become unsustainable. But sooner or later, the retreat routes might be already unviable too. So if you give it too late, the routes out are unviable, and the order to retreat will have to be given. Now the Russians control the logistical routes of Pokrovsk and Minograd, and they've controlled them for a long time now. The anti-drone nets are useless. If the Russians can fly tens of FPVs from a couple of kilometres away, there is no safe route anymore to enter, exit or evacuate the city, and there hasn't been one for some time now. Again, what do we talk about? Attritional warfare, reducing potential. And we can see from Mr. Clement Molan here, we'll go through this later, about the airstrikes that have been happening around Pokrovsk and the routes in and out. That's just from airstrikes, let alone barrel and drone. The Ukrainian command should immediately start a controlled withdrawal from the field south of the agglomeration and start the urban battle. So south down in these sectors in here, to pull back and begin the urban battle, which will at least slightly relieve the pressure and shorten the front. As well, the advantages Russia has on manpower, artillery, both glide, fab, drone, actually reduces in close terrain, be urban or like a forest, like Kremenar. That's why we don't see movement much in there, which will at least slightly relieve the pressure and shorten the front, with the added benefit of having a shorter route of retreat if the situation gets critical. So if it moves right up into here, urban battle, quicker area to get out and shortens the front from defending this whole southern area. I am almost certain that this will not happen until the very last moment, confirming that the Ukrainian command does not learn from its mistakes, unlike the Russian. Again, I agree with Mr. Playver here that this is the correct strategic decision to make, but I also agree that no, this is not going to occur, because we haven't seen it happen all these other times that there has been an opportunity to have a withdrawal and it hasn't occurred, and it always happens too late. But I also don't believe that the Russians want to get pulled into Pokrovsk, that they want to remain controlling the logistics route in here and reducing potential through attrition. Same as in Toretsk. Why would they not close it off? Because you keep sending people in. The Ukrainians continue to fail to understand that this is drone war and old methods do not work anymore, but only kill the men that are under whoever uses them. It is not easy to do it in wartime, but the Ukrainian command needs to be reformed as soon as possible. If there's one issue I would resolve right now, it's that. And you hear from everyone from frontline to real analysts talk about the command needs to be reformed, but because you're not allowed to criticise any part of this and it's covered up by then governments, politicians, bloggers, propagandists, even analysts, that because there's no criticism allowed to be made, you're never going to bring sunlight to disinfect it. Have I already said this 1,000 times? Yes. Will I continue to say it? Yes. Incapable commanders are criminally killing their subordinates, sending them into senseless assaults without knowing the situation, or being misinformed by lower commanders, which fear repercussions. The whole system is plagued, and this will bring the Ukrainian army down with it. So what I'll say from playthrough in here is, he says a drone war. I think drones themselves are actually overestimated somewhat on the battlefield. It's not a be-all, end-all weapon. It is incredibly deadly. It's changed warfare, but this is still why I put drones under artillery. This is still a war of fires and a war of attrition. That artillery still causes the most amount of battlefield casualties, and drones are a part of that. And drones are part of what I call then rotor artillery. Then you have glide artillery like your FABs, and you've got glide, and then you've got like barrel artillery, and it still works all as one. And I think there has been for Ukraine over-reliance on drones, not saying, yeah, but we still need, yes, we need men to pilot them, but a drone pilot can't seize and hold terrain. They work as guided artillery to help the frontline infantry or armoured movements move to seize and hold terrain, working as guided low-cost artillery. But of course, these areas, what we hear from Ukrainian soldiers again and again is anything within 15 Ks is then massively, massively restricted due to drones. And this is what we speak about, like we spoke about up in Kupiansk, is Ukraine has to then have these areas in the red of what they can bring logistics in and out, where when you are the one doing the enveloping, you have a lot longer area that you can bring pieces in from multiple different directions. Russia know exactly where everything is going to cross into here, and that's why shortening the front, getting in an urban stalled battle to actually have a successful, somewhat controlled withdrawal may actually be some of the move, as we should have seen in many different areas. Let's return back to Pokrovsk. Actually, did I delete? Sorry. Situation 4. No, didn't delete it. I thought I deleted the wrong one. Return back to Pokrovsk, and let's assume that the Ukrainians retreated from the agglomeration. What can they count on after the retreat? Here is the new Donbas line in its full glory. I'll show you in a sec. Ukraine's Syrsky line, an engineering masterpiece. I advise you go check out my thread on the new Donbas line. In short, ideally, there are lines of barbed wire, 2 anti-tank ditches filled with barbed wire, a line of dragon's teeth, and barbed wire and iron rods between them. Remember when everyone said dragon's teeth don't work? They do work. Another barbed wire, everything before the natural obstacle like a river, which is beyond a dominant hill, on top of which are Ukrainian drone operators and repeaters controlling 24/7 from sturdy, reinforced and camouflage trench systems. By the way, they're building a second line just like the first in front of it. So we see Then this is Pokrovsk sitting down in here, and these lines getting construction or under construction. Then again, I always say what we are seeing is we're seeing some very hardened, well-built lines with fuck all resistance in them due to manpower problems. And we have seen, especially in Kharkiv, where tens of millions of dollars were put into defensive positions that people have either said they were in simply the wrong area because they were built by contractors and not soldiers, or that money disappeared and they never got built. Basically, taking it frontally is extremely hard, if not impossible. So taking these lines front on. Unless the Ukrainians have a critical shortage of resource in a certain area, or the defensive line is not complete somewhere. So if the line's not complete or there's a critical shortage, it's going to be very difficult to get through. For example, between these two areas, I'm unsure why the Ukrainians left that hole. The two sections around it were completed months ago, which looks to be exactly what the Russians are aiming for, and reach their spearhead on Novoshakovhe, I'll show you in a second, other than reaching Dobropilia, the defensive line behind it, and the second line I was talking about, not yet complete, in front of the town, and simply lengthening the front even more. So, what we see here is, see this spire coming out here in the direction of Novoshakovhe? Why have the Russians pushed out there? Well, we bring up the maps we're talking about, and we see this. This is Petrivka, this is Rubzane, we see this is in this same area here. They're aiming for this hole right in here, and if we zoom out on this map, this is the hole right in here. This is exactly what they've been aiming for in this direction, the hole in the line. The problem is, if there's a breach in this line, then the lines themselves become an ineffective, expensive waste. This is exactly what Ukraine tried to do on their offensive down towards Tokmak, was to get into the line and then flank basically the entire line to make it very expensive and very inefficient. And as Mr. Playfair talks about in this, to reach Dobropilia, this is what they're going for, is this hole in the line to get in and around Dobropilia, which would cause a lot of problems for other supply into Donetsk, because Pokrovsk was one of the central hubs in here. The logistics are all under control. It's moved back and back into some of these areas, such as Bilozerke, Dobropilia, to supply into Kramatorsk, Toretsk, all these then areas. Let's continue. The big problem with this is the long term. I don't think it's likely the Russians will continue to the fields west of Dobropilia. It's Dobropilia and the fields to the west of here. The region is extremely rural and gives no benefits to fight for, if not to further lengthen the front, but that will not be necessarily play in Russia's favour. I think it's much more likely the Russians will focus on finishing the capture of Donetsk region's administrative territory. Blocking this are four very big cities: Konstantinivka, Druskivka, Kramatorsk, and Sloviansk. Regardless of what everyone tells you, these cannot be taken frontally. The only way the current conditions and situation is to flank them. And what better way to go through the open fields on the tactical height west? And would you look at that? The Russians are also making an effort to reach this area and Liman from the Proto-Pinsa. In short, attempting to reach again from the 22 situation when Sloviansk was seriously threatened from both Izium and Liman. Now, the operation is something gigantic. Many fortifications, and even the Syrsky Donetsk River will block this, and many capable Ukrainian units, but the Russians have no alternative. And if they don't have alternatives, they'll do whatever they can do, as they did in the past. We must also remember, Ukraine is much more weakened than it used to be in 22-23, both for manpower, morale, and Western support. And this is exactly what he's speaking about. And let's zoom out on this map to have a look. So this, of course, is Pokrovsk. And then we have the Terney front, where Russia obviously is putting a lot of assets in to try and move this. So we see this front in here. We see Liman. We have Sloviansk. We have Kramatorsk. These are the major areas then remaining. And what he's talking about is this movement in here, eventually in much larger operations, is to meet with this, that this front will turn in the direction of Liman. We have spoken about this to try and build further envelopment on then Syrsky, but then outflank Sloviansk and Kramatorsk, because frontally on Sloviansk, Kramatorsk, these major areas, is going to be very challenging, if not impossible, and that this is all part of a much larger operation, but to bypass some of the more hardened areas and cut off a lot of the supplying routes. In conclusion, the situation for Pokrovsk, Minograd agglomeration is very, very difficult without exaggeration and on the brink of critical. The Ukrainian command should have already have everything ready for a fast and organised retreat for what's possible, or should stabilise immediately the Rodyansk flank, which is definitely easier said than done. So the Rodyansk flank in here, on the eastern northeastern flank, to try and stabilise this, because if this starts getting cut off, you're in a critical area from Krasny, Liman, Rodyansk situation in here. It's already critical, which is definitely easier said than done. At the moment, what worries me most is Krasny Liman, which, if captured, threatens to very simply bypass the Ukrainian defensive nodes of Rodyansky and Minograd and Novo-Shakhovka, which is a foothold where were to be gained there would start the Dobropilia chapter. So if they can get a foothold in Rodyansk in here, cutting off then the logistics to the south of here, and then this sweep around from the north, sweep around the south, and then the next step being then Dobropilia. The Ukrainians should immediately close the Bilozyrsky, Zolotny, Kolodiaz gap in the obstacle line, that gap we showed you, and send reserves in this direction instead of slaughtering them in senseless counter-attacks. Anyways, regardless of the Ukrainian command's efforts, and unless a sizable counter-attack happens, which is extremely unlikely in my view, and I agree, the agglomeration is doomed to fall by the end of the year. And efforts should be made to strengthen preemptively the lines you see in the picture to avoid outflanking manoeuvre that would finally spell the end for the Ukrainian control of the Donbas. And what we see is he's talking about Kramatorsk, Sloviansk. This is very zoomed out in here. But the lines of control, the high points in here, that these need to be controlled, reinforced, so there's not a major flank around complete areas. What is being left out of this is how the Pokrovsk sector meets with the Velika Novosilka sector, how these are not mutually exclusive, they are mutually beneficial, and why Russia is pushing so hard in the south. And could we see then up to Zap and the defensive lines that sit fairly shallow relatively from Orikhiv to Huliapol through to Velika, and an outflank of that sector as well. Just like I spoke about before, that these any movements politically, militarily, strategically, tactically are all intertwined like an organism. So we've got this map just to point out some of the critical areas in here of where this is pushing: Dobropilia, Bilozyrsky, Zoloty Kolyaz, where Russia is trying to push, get through that gap and move around and outmaneuver Dobropilia, Pokrovsk while attriting in other areas. I think we will still see, I think we'll see Pokrovsk fall by the end of the year. I think we'll see it fall reasonably quickly once it begins, but I think it could take some time. It depends on the attrition rate that the Russian command is seeing in here. Is that another point on that? Yeah, I think we'll see it move. But the next steps, I'm not sure if it's going to move north or it's going to move west. I know a lot of people think it's going to move north on Kramatorsk-Sloviansk. I still think we could see more of a western push. There's been a lot of effort around Velika, a lot of effort into Dnipropetrovsk Oblast, and a lot of effort down in the south. But to further reconfirm this, we have a great analyst, Clement Molan, speaking about this. And this is this direction in here. This is then the Poltavkia direction, Popov Yar area. So around this eastern side, 450 airstrikes in 8 days. I believe he had a post following this saying there was like another 100. And we can see by the airstrikes that a lot of resources getting put to move this forward and strike logistics in. And he says if the Russian offensive is not stopped, they will continue their path to the north with the ultimate goal of to avoid fighting in the big cities and avoid that front on, then envelop and outflank. If Rodyansky falls, as we have spoken about Rodyansky and these areas, Dobropilia, Rodyansky areas, I've got a map pointed out on here. This is where Russia is moving. Ukrainian forces will be forced to retreat from the fields to defend the centre and gain precious time. So if this area falls, there needs to be a withdrawal back into Pokrovsk, gain time, but also a withdrawal, which we know those orderly strategic withdrawals are not a strong point when you're fighting a war that is based a lot in optics optics equaling support and pulling back, it's very, very difficult to support that. But this movement through the Dobropilia, below Syrsky, around high grounds in the back of Kramatorsk-Sloviansk and through the defensive positions. And a defensive position can be whatever you'd like it to be, but you need a lot of people in those too. And what Russia's best defense against air defense, against fighter jets, against defensive positions, against whatever, the best defense is attrition. The best defense against an F-16 is attrition in Pokrovsk or attrition in Terny. The best defense against Patriot systems is the same. The best defense against Kursk was the same. Because what we're seeing, we're seeing people from the Air Force getting rounded up and getting sent into the infantry. So the best defense in an attritional war is positive attrition ratio. And when you're numerically superior and lengthening the front line helps you, you have a lot easier time doing this. But by being on the offense too, you're constantly changing and adapting tactics as we have seen. And many people are now saying back to me about what I've been saying for some time, that it's little by little, then all at once. Are we seeing the all at once? I'm not convinced. But don't separate politics and war. War is politics by other means, whether it is an insurgency, whether it's an attritional war, whether it's a world war. War is politics by other means. But also, that means politics then affects the war and vice versa too. What is happening in Kyiv and Lviv and in Zelensky's ivory tower is a reflection of the battlefield and decisions to be made. It's not completely separate. When you have a country at an all-out war like this, everything from a parking ticket through to frontline strategy is to do with the war, and all things are pointing there. But event horizons are all pointing at one singularity on the front line at the moment, which maybe there's an opportunity to move out of if some very tough decisions are made. But I don't think anyone's willing to make those with the sunken cost fallacy of protracted attritional war and how it would look on the Allies' support. Legends, long video. I hope that you were doing really, really well. I'm going to go see my oncologist and I don't know when I'm going to start the treatment, but bear with me if I have some time off over the next week. Look after yourselves and I will speak to you tomorrow. Thank you. Bye-bye.